Turning Tides is an AntiKs entertainment production. You can find the show on social media at the Turning Tides Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube, and at Turning Tides Pod on Bluesky and Mastodon. For more information, or if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or collaborating, please contact us at theturningtidespodcast@gmail.com. Thank you. Warning, this episode of Turning Tides contains depictions of violence, child abuse, cannibalism, war, sexual themes, and racism.
Before we start today's episode, I need to address some of the terminology I will be using for this series. The Puebloan, or Pueblo peoples, which I will be discussing, have gone by a variety of names throughout their long history. Additionally, each tribe has their own name to delineate their specific ancestry. That being said, the ancestors of the Pueblo peoples have often been described using the outdated term Anasazi. This term was given to the people by the Navajo, who inhabited the regions which the Puebloans had vacated during the 14th century. The term Anasazi roughly translates to ancient enemies. For obvious reasons, this term has fallen out of use and has been replaced with Ancestral Puebloan. Unfortunately, there are also issues with the term Puebloan, which is the Spanish word for house dweller, or one who lives in the town. David Roberts rightfully points out, quote, "The term Puebloan derives from the language of an oppressor who treated the indigenes of the Southwest far more brutally than the Navajo ever did," unquote. Throughout this series, I will endeavor to refer to them collectively as the Puebloan people, or if I am being specific, I will say the people of Mesa Verde, or Chaco Canyon, etc. That being said, most of the sources for this series still refer to a portion of these peoples as the Anasazi, in spite of admitting its offensive nature. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to my producer and my fiancée, Melissa Marie Brown. Without her, this show wouldn't exist, and it's thanks to her hard work that we're coming to you with the new season of Turning Tides. Thank you. Deep in the American Southwest, amongst the juniper, mesquite, and sagebrush, abandoned monuments and settlements dot the landscape. These communities were not constructed by aliens, nor Atlanteans. They are, in fact, the remnants of a 10,000-year-old civilization, which still flourishes today, albeit in a different locale. Known as the Ancestral Puebloans, these peoples have inhabited parts of the Southwest since the earliest recorded human activity in North America. During their heyday, they built towers which reached up to the heavens in order to better study the sky. They also held ceremonies in subterranean lairs, in which they called on the spirits of the underworld to deliver rain in return for blood and human sacrifice. How these people migrated, why they left their original haunt, Colorado Plateau, and what their structures meant have been the cause of debate since white Anglo-archaeologists first, quote-unquote, discovered their ruins in the late 19th and early 20th century. Dr. Jesse Rasta tells us that the first people to arrive in the Southwest were the, quote, Folsom culture, who left the earliest records of their passing roughly 10,000 years ago, unquote. These people were hunter-gatherers who likely lived in caves and natural outcroppings as opposed to constructing their own dwellings. Little is known of these people. Around 2,500 years ago, following the introduction of corn most likely via trade from Mexico, the people living in this region began to form a distinct culture. Thus began what archaeologists refer to as the basket maker era or culture. They were named for the intricate baskets they weaved, which have survived the wear and tear of a millennia. They domesticated corn and were prodigious hunters as well. They used the atlatl, or Mesoamerican throwing spear, in order to hunt deer, pronghorn, and other fauna of the prehistoric Southwest. The basket makers then began constructing rudimentary in-ground dwellings called pit houses. The basket makers' most enduring legacy remains their extravagant and stunning rock art, which can still be found all across the Southwest. They drew pictures of bighorn rams and other animals, geometric designs, and anthropomorphic beings containing various animal as well as human qualities. These sites and etchings were clearly renowned by the basket makers' Puebloan ancestors, who often added their own petroglyphs on top of basket maker art. David Roberts speculates that this was done to imbue these ancient carvings with new life and meaning. Around 500 AD, the basket makers began to change once more. First with the advent of rudimentary storage structures, and then through their first attempts at pottery. The basket makers began using the bow and arrow as opposed to the atlatl, and they introduced mesquite beans into their diets, likely in order to supplement the falling number of animals available for their consumption. It was not until the 8th century AD that the first signs of cultural divergence began to appear in the archaeological record of the basket makers. Durango, Colorado to Durango, Mexico, and Las Vegas, Nevada to Las Vegas, New Mexico composed the ancient Southwest in which we are dealing. During this time, 5 distinct cultures sprang up. Buddy May says these were the Anasazi, in today's Four Corners region, the Sinagua, who lived around the peaks of Mount San Francisco and along the Little Colorado River. Around modern-day Phoenix, Arizona, the Hohokam were master irrigators and farmers. Closely related to them in terms of burial practices were the Salado culture. Finally, the Mohoyan inhabited large swathes of southern New Mexico, western Texas, and northern Mexico. The period around 750 AD was a hallmark era for the peoples of the Southwest, and it is the official start of the Pueblo I era. The early Puebloans had begun to construct above-ground structures made of brick, mortar, stone, and adobe. The original pit houses remained in many places, and some archaeologists argue that they were transformed into what are now called kivas. Today, kivas are defined as rectangular, above-ground structures, which are ceremonial in nature and used exclusively by the men of the clan to which the kiva belongs. In 750 AD, their appearance was totally different, as they were circular and built into the ground. The rectangular shape was a design which was applied to kivas much later in Puebloan history, although some speculate the rectangular design was used on occasions. The kiva's true function remains undetermined. Perhaps they were used as they are now, like in-ground ceremonial buildings. However, recent research and the theories of Dr. Stephen Lekson seem to indicate that the kiva was initially little more than a communal center where certain skills were taught or where people resided temporarily. Regardless, there are certain key aspects of kivas which have undergone little change over the centuries. They were usually well ventilated, filled with benches or stools, and almost all had a sipapu. Craig Childs describes the sipapu as a, quote, small hole said to be the passage from the underworld to this world, unquote. Besides the standard size kiva, there were great kivas where it is postulated that entire villages or clans could congregate, perhaps at a time of crisis or to celebrate. Alongside their advancements in construction, these early Pueblo peoples began diverging from their ancestors in other ways as well. They developed trash middens, which are archaeological treasure troves today, but functioned as little more than a refuse pile to the people who used them. They domesticated turkeys, dogs, and maybe even jackrabbits. The dogs likely assisted in defending the village and with hunting, while the turkeys were often sacrificed in place of a human. The ritual sacrifice of turkeys is still practiced across the Southwest and Meso and Central America by some native peoples today. The Puebloans started making more and more refined forms of pottery. This included making corrugated pottery, which featured necks and pour spouts. Throughout this time, it is largely agreed upon that the Pueblo peoples had no centralized political structure, meaning decisions happened at the community level. It is likely that the society which existed was matrilineal in nature, meaning that land, clan, and family name was passed along through the matriarch's family line. This is still the case today amongst the Puebloans. To be clear, this does not mean Puebloan society is a feminist utopia. Some Puebloan women have been accused of practicing witchcraft, which is a quote-unquote sin that is punishable by death. Additionally, there is evidence that Puebloan women were sacrificed after their husband's death in order to be buried alongside them. Around 900 AD, a catalyst of unknown origin propelled the people living on the Colorado Plateau into what many have called the, quote, Puebloan Golden Age, unquote. Some theorize it came in the form of invading Mesoamerican chiefs in search of new lands to claim for themselves. Others claim it was a totally organic, logical step for some grouping of people to assert themselves over a large geographic area. In either case, this golden age would begin the rise of hundreds of years of rich history, migration, abandonment, and resurgence. All of this started in Chaco Canyon. Seemingly desolate, Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico was once home to thousands of people. This is where the first Pueblo great houses were built. These were grand structures that were once the tallest man-made construction projects throughout the Southwest. Some, like Pueblo Bonito, are twice the square footage of the White House in Washington, D.C. Their purpose, much like the Kivas, remains elusive. Theories about their function abound, and they range the spectrum from palaces for the elites, giant ceremonial centers for a specialized religious sect, a series of trading warehouses for communally shared goods, prehistoric interstellar observatories, and halfway homes for weary Puebloan travelers. Of all these theories, the one which asserts that the great houses were palaces for elites seems the most likely, as there exists a great deal of indirect evidence for it. First of all, the area of Chaco Canyon is a relatively barren landscape which is bereft of a natural source of water. This made agricultural endeavors, which were supposed to feed thousands, nearly impossible. To counter this, the people of Chaco installed numerous but rudimentary irrigation ditches, stop dams, and other implementations in order to conserve as much water for farming and drinking as possible. But the only conceivable way the population could be sustained is if food and water were imported in large amounts. Additionally, there were prehistoric roads which all led to Chaco. These went on for miles in all directions. Their purpose, like most early Puebloan practices, remains ill-defined. There does not appear to have been much travel along these roads, and some believe they served as strictly ceremonial architecture meant to represent the power exuded from Chaco. These roads cut through natural obstacles and wound up and down mountains. They were about as large as a modern two-lane road in the United States. Dennis Doxeter called this harnessing of the natural world an attempt by Chacoan elites to create a quote-unquote geo-ritual landscape in order to exert political or spiritual power over the populace. Besides roads and grand structures, line-of-sight relays likely existed which linked settlements via the hilltops. This meant settlements would be able to assist one another in times of war or warn each other of impending danger. Whatever truly happened at Chaco, trade was at the nexus of it all. Nearly everything excavated from the massive site was imported from somewhere else. There were colorful tropical birds like macaws, drinkable chocolate, copper bells, and exquisitely crafted wooden flutes from Mexico. Pottery and water jugs came from southern Utah and western Arizona. From the metropolis of Cahokia on the Mississippi Delta, Chacoans received a fermented liquid which archaeologists call black drink. Most impressively, shells of various hues from the Pacific Ocean were turned into jewelry. This is clear evidence that a vast trade network existed between the various pre-Columbian peoples of the Americas. Even the wood used for the great houses was imported. Kyle Winder says, quote, "The large wooden beams used in the construction of the great houses have been documented to have come from a distance of 50 to 100 miles away, including the San Mateo Mountains." Unquote. Undoubtedly, the man-hours necessary for the construction of the great houses was intense, and if tree ring data is correct, construction took decades before a project's completion. Generations would have worked on these structures. How exactly did Chaco Canyon manage to function in the face of numerous natural obstacles and go on to become a center for prehistoric economic exchange for hundreds of years? Once more, only theories exist. For years, researchers have taken for granted that the Puebloan structure of society today, which is largely socialistic, has always existed. Archaeologists have used this premise to postulate that Chaco was a mass ceremonial center for religious pilgrimage, and the priesthood acted as a ceremonial upper class but did not wield political power. Others, like Stephen Lekson and Kyle Winder, argue Chaco showed clear signs of wealth and political power disparities. Stephen Lekson refers to a study called Degrees and Kinds of Inequality, in which the researchers, Robert Drennan, Christian Peterson, and Jake Fox, compare burial sites across history from so-called intermediate societies. Out of all these separate comparisons, Chaco showed some of the highest disparities amongst burials, beating out all others in terms of inequality, save for the Olmec and the settlement of Setiocanti. Some of the burials at Chaco were sophisticated and seemingly regal, while others involved family members placing a simple stone slab over the deceased and placing the body in their family's trash midden. Additionally, there's irrefutable proof that at least two kinds of people lived side by side in Chaco Canyon. This was throughout its rise and its eventual fall. These may have been separate races, but one group showed more signs of malnourishment, and they were physically smaller than the other, leading further credence to the existence of an upper class at Chaco. An upper class which was so powerful and rich that the inequality showed itself in the people's very skeletons. Stephen H. Lekson goes a step further than most when he asserts several statements about Chaco that he considers axioms. He says great houses were clearly different and designed to be a sort of bureaucratic capital for the authorities or nobility. He claims the idea of great houses being mere storage facilities is ludicrous. People lived in the great houses, but fewer than we assume. He says that based on these two facts, the people who lived inside the great houses were ordained by the powers that be, or society at large, as quote-unquote special. Branching off of this, he asserts Chaco was indeed a class-based society, where violence, murder, and cannibalism were often used to enforce the will of the few upon the many. He says there were outlier great houses, which defined the true extent of Chacoan power. He says that roads and line-of-sight relays were used to further bolster this power. He claims the true extent of Chaco's territory was around the size of Indiana, and it likely held sway over a population of 60 to 100,000 people. Finally, He says Chaco was a truly cosmopolitan place to live. Multiple ethnicities and language groups lived alongside one another and worked for the betterment of the upper classes. Stephen Lekson defined these traits as all being similar to that of an Altepetl, or a Nahua Mesoamerican-style city-state. When Anglo-archaeologists first began excavating the settlement at Chaco Canyon, one of the sites they uncovered was Room 33. It was here that Plog and Heitman say, quote-unquote, 14 individuals were exhumed, each one adorned with refinements which screamed royalty. Amongst the bodies, and specifically placed with his head turned toward the setting sun, the turquoise priest lay with his skull bashed in. Around him were women with a similar wound to the head. Kyle Widner speculates that the priest, who died around 875, was killed as a result of a lower class rising, and the death of the women around him was ceremonially performed as a means of sacrifice. This man, whoever he was clearly considered special by the Chacoans. He towered over the average Chacoan at 6 foot tall, and he was found buried with over 10,000 turquoise beads alongside him. This is almost 80% of all the turquoise ever excavated from Chaco. Those who visit the Pueblo ruins today will likely see thousands of pieces of pottery which litter the ground. At Chaco, pottery was likely imported en masse, but its initial creation deserves a moment's explanation. A potter would mix balls of clay with crushed rock, sand, and even broken pottery to temper and harden the wet clay. The clay is then rolled into long strands, which are placed one on top of the other until the rough shape of a pot is formed. Next, the potter smooths out each strand of clay until they mesh seamlessly with the others. Once the pot was dried, it would be fired in a kiln. Temperatures had to be perfect. The slightest mishap would result in cracked pottery. If all went well, master painters, using brushes made of yucca fiber and natural mineral paints, would set to work, adding extravagant designs which were usually region or culture specific. The skill of these ancient craftspeople is evident by the wealth of perfectly intact Puebloan pottery which still exists. The reason for the broken pottery was likely ceremonial. Many speculate that people came from miles around simply to shatter their pottery at Chaco. Perhaps this was a form of mourning when a great chief or king died. Perhaps it was a sort of tax on those entering Chaco. What we know is that today, the ceremonial practice of breaking pottery is still performed, usually to honor a dead loved one and to have the piece be reborn in the next world. This next world was referred to as the Flower World by Mesoamericans and many in the prehistoric Southwest. The Flower World in Meso and Oasis American mythology was a beautiful place where all was green, work was shared communally, and existence was eternal. The identification of Flower World symbolism is a relatively new discovery amongst researchers of the Southwest. When exactly the Flower World proliferated amongst the population is up for debate. Some claim that as early as the domestication of corn, around 2000 B.C.E., the Flower World was very real for the people of the Southwest. Others, like Michael Mathewitz, says it arrived much later, around 900, which would mean the Flower World's introduction to the Southwest coincides almost perfectly with the rise of Chaco Canyon as a regional Altepetl. Of all the characters associated with the Flower World, none is more recognizable than Cocopelli. Cocopelli is a southwestern deity who is represented in countless petroglyphs, with what appears to be a hunchback, an erect penis, and some long object in his mouth. Many have speculated that the object in his mouth is a flute, which was certainly a huge aspect of southwestern culture. Others, my father for example, instantly see a huge pipe. Cocopelli's likeness dates back to as early as 200 AD. numerous attempts have been made by researchers to link Kokopelli with other prehistoric American deities. Most famously, Kokopelli and Xocopili have drawn numerous comparisons. Xocopili is the Aztec god of music, flower, dance, and fertility. Jason Mankey claims the biggest issue with this theory is that the Aztec people do not have a clear archaeological history until about 1250 AD, and Xocopili has never been depicted with a hunchback. The fact that many descendants of the Aztec consider Chaco to be the fabled Atzitlan supports this theory, however, though archaeologists have found no hard evidence supporting such a conclusion, and many vehemently deny that any such connection exists. Additionally, some speculate that the supposed hunchback belonging to Kokopelli is actually a traveling pack. Today, Kokopelli's image has been usurped and appropriated all across the Southwest to sell everything from t-shirts to lighters to wine and even snow globes. Besides petroglyphs representing Kokopelli, Puebloan rock art was focused on creating something truly unique for its time and place. In the words of Kyle Winder, quote, Fajada Butte, inside the Chaco Culture National Historical Park, plays host to what may be the most interesting site in all of Southwest prehistory, the Sun Dagger. Artist Anna Sofair was documenting rock art in 1977 when she noticed two petroglyphs. She returned on the day of the summer solstice to confirm her belief that this was an ancient astronomical mechanism. At the peak of the sun, on the day of the summer solstice, a thin triangular shaft of light penetrates the exact middle of the larger petroglyph. The Sun Dagger accurately tracks an 18.6-year cycle of the moon, marking its major and minor standstills. Unquote. This astronomical wonder was dated back to the Chacoan Golden Age of 950 to 1150 AD. But in 1989, the two slabs of stone which created this phenomenon shifted, forever destroying the Sun Dagger. Besides the discovery of the Sun Dagger, it was further revealed that Chaco was constructed with the stars in mind. This is best seen at Chimney Rock, where David Roberts writes, quote, Kim Malville discovered using carbon-14 dates from roof timbers that the Chacoan outlier at Chimney Rock was built in two phases, one at AD 1075 and one at 1094. These happen to have been the dates of two successive lunar standstills. Unquote. Off to the side of Chimney Rock Monument are two standing rocks that resemble chimneys, hence the name. If one were to stand in between these rocks on the day of a lunar standstill on the winter solstice, the moon would pass perfectly between them. Kyle Winder, speaking on further evidence of archaeoastronomy, says, quote, The most isolated and easternmost Chacoan ruin is Wijiji. From a spot on the ledge near the apparent sun symbol, the winter solstice sunrise emerges from behind the top of a pillar. The Great Kiva, Casa Rinconada, could have contained multiple solar and lunar marking mechanisms. Unquote. On the other hand, a much darker side of Chaco existed. In recent years, a mountain of evidence has shattered the illusions of many archaeologists who saw Chaco as a peaceful, egalitarian place. In reality, violence, death, and an early grave was the norm at Chaco, especially for those deemed unimportant enough for sacrifice. Starting in 950 AD, writers David Roberts and researcher Christy Turner began uncovering evidence of violent deaths and cannibalism at Chaco. Christy Turner was at the forefront of this research, and he emphasizes that the violence at Chaco was likely due to Mesoamerican conquest of the area, which would line up with Stephen Lekson's Altepetl theory. David Roberts explains that Turner used a strict criteria for cannibalism based on 6 distinct signs. Turner showed a fibula, intentionally broken in order to suck out the bone marrow. Next, he showed a severely fractured skull of an 8-year-old girl. it showed signs of what Turner called quote-unquote anvil abrasions. As it sounds, her skull was propped up against a rock and bashed in. Then she was likely scalped. The final and clearest sign of cannibalism lay in bones, which showed signs of so-called pot polishing. This sheen left on the bones was from them tumbling inside a pot. Below Sleeping Ute Mountain, inside a charred dwelling, a pile of ancient human feces was discovered. Inside this coprolite was the bone marrow of at least one human being. Upon further analysis, the remains of 4 separate individuals were found in the ancient feces. Although it is a taboo subject, cannibalism was practiced often in other areas of the world as well. Europeans were no exception, with many doctors practicing medical cannibalism well into the 19th century. It's important to emphasize that not all the peoples who lived in the ancient Southwest engaged in cannibalism, but some did, almost always as a result of desperation. However, if Stephen Lekson is correct, the authorities of Chaco, their outlier great houses, and their predecessors used cannibalism as a potent means of keeping the population in check. This helps explain the modern view by many Puebloans, which depicts Chaco as a place where evil things happened for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. Having discussed Chaco in some detail, we will now shift our focus to the rest of the Southwest in an attempt to identify these outlier great houses which exerted power on behalf of Chaco and perhaps asserted their own independent power over their own subjects. The most clear signs of this lie around Salmon ruins, which were constructed around the same time as the fall of Chaco, and is postulated to be a continuation of that power. Near Green Mask Springs in Chaco Canyon, Utah, David Roberts describes the burial of a perfectly mummified human body dubbed the Princess. Her grave was adorned with basket maker-era artwork, and her body was preserved in a turkey feather blanket, which was further embellished with bluebird feathers. Her mummified body was painted half red and half yellow. Roberts then describes the Bernheimer alcove in Moki Canyon, which contained a rich treasure trove of basket maker tools and goods. There were sandals made of yucca, belts made of human hair, and cradle boards for infants, which were still soft at this point. In the future, these cradle boards would become flat and hard, resulting in the flattening of Puebloan skulls for many generations. In fact, this is one of the clear delineations between the Puebloan and basket maker eras. At Canyon de Chelly, there were many signs of human activity, which had been there since the early ADs. Around 1060, White House Ruin was first constructed, and several other pueblos like it sprang up throughout the canyon. One of the most ominous discoveries made by archaeologists here was the burial of the hands. Buddy Mays relates, quote, "Here archaeologists uncovered a pair of human arms lying side by side with their elbows touching the cave wall. Abalone shell pendants had been wrapped around each wrist, and sandals and baskets filled with beads lay nearby." Unquote. It was speculated that the rest of their body could not be recovered. Perhaps just as gruesome as this was the cut-in-two man found at Grand Gulch. His mummy was found cut in two, the sections of his body sewn together with human hair, and a pained grimace still fixed upon his face. Monument Valley, a part of the Navajo Reservation today, was once home to the Kayenta, a subgroup of the people of the Four Corners. They were known for their exquisite pottery. Sometime around 800 to 1100, the Diné, or Navajo people, arrived in the area. The Navajo are originally an Athabascan people from modern-day western British Columbia and eastern Alaska. The reason for their departure from their homeland remains unknown, although some speculate a massive volcanic eruption in the area was the catalyst for their sudden migration. Their date of arrival also remains up for debate, though it seems to have been any time between the 3rd century and the 16th century. The relationship between the Dene and the Puebloans was one of armed neutrality. As the world they knew destabilized with increasing drought and new enemies, their relations would become increasingly hostile. This hostility persists into the modern day. On the other hand, just as much evidence exists of friendly relations between the Puebloans and the Navajo, and towards the end of their respective independence, both would fuse their cultures for several generations in an attempt to hold out against European colonization. Ironically, as the Navajo gave the name Anasazi to the Puebloans, who lived in the Four Corners region, so too did the Puebloans give the name Navajo to the Dene people. The word Navajo is a bastardization of the Puebloan word Navajo, meaning a large area of uncultivated land. This naming was undoubtedly due to the nomadic nature of Navajo society. In Chaco, astronomical phenomena appeared throughout the sky with great frequency. Starting in 968 with a total solar eclipse, interstellar events began to excite, and likely terrify, the authorities at Chaco. Next, Halley's Comet roared overhead in 989. Then in 1006, the brightest supernova in recorded history appeared, staying lit in the sky for more than 3 months. Finally, another supernova appeared, casting a light across the globe for 23 days. This event was recorded in ancient Chinese texts. Beyond the increasing number of interesting astronomical occurrences, events on the ground foreshadowed a cataclysm as well. 6 years after the 1054 supernova appeared, a massive volcanic explosion rocked northern Arizona. Craig Child says, quote, "It buried 800 miles of land in glowing cinders," unquote. Whole villages were likely swallowed up. Then Halley's Comet reappeared, and then strange black spots began to appear on the sun for an entire decade. These omens must have been heavy on the minds of the skywatchers in Chaco Canyon. Down south, events along the Gila River were also reaching a fever pitch. The Hohokam and migrants from Chaco came together and fused their cultures into the Puebloan Peoples. This civilization followed their northern neighbors at a slower pace, but by 1000 AD, the peoples along the Puebloan Rim were living above ground and likely served as important trade partners and go-betweens for the Hohokam and the people of Chaco. Concurrently, the people around Salinas and Pecos laid the foundation for their settlements, which were soon to grow into population hubs of their own respect. To the northwest, Yellow Jacket ruins and the soon-to-be-built cliff palaces of Mesa Verde lay dormant, with perhaps only a handful of dry farmers attempting to eke out an existence there. As we will come to learn, one of the truly astounding aspects of the Puebloan people's history was their ability to migrate, abandon, and readjust their entire society to a new place relatively quickly. Some may argue that their migrations were a sign of a quote-unquote weak society, but considering the time and place in which the ancestral Puebloans lived, they had no choice but to follow the rains or risk certain destruction. There's a reason why virtually no one lives in this area of the United States today, and it's likely one of the many reasons the golden age of Chaco ended. People voted with their feet and left when they realized water was no longer blessing their crops. For years, archaeologists have speculated about the mystery of Chaco Canyon. In reality, Chaco is one of the most studied archaeological sites in the history of the United States. The true quote-unquote mystery around Chaco was why exactly the people left and why they decided to move into the classic Pueblo III era cliff dwellings. As we have established, Chaco was likely a hierarchical society which used violence as a form of coercion. The archaeological record is bereft of any signs of organized warfare. This has led some to declare this time period the Pax Chacoan era, in reference to the Pax Romana of the 1st and 2nd century A.D. As with all empires, kingdoms, and governments, the line between violence and peace was fine in Chaco. Authorities provided lavish ceremonies, impressive building projects, and corn. In return, the population provided hundreds of thousands of hours of human labor. It's estimated that the Great House of Pueblo Bonito alone took over 800,000 man-hours to complete. Sometime around 1130, likely due to climate change, Chacoan authorities found it more and more difficult to predict the health of the harvest and to summon the rains. The reason for their failure? A massive drought was sweeping the region, and it grew especially bad around 1150. This drought likely spread disease and increased mortality rates at Chaco as well. What exactly happened is, of course, up for debate. First of all, it's largely agreed upon that climate change, exacerbated by human activity, played a huge factor in the people's decision to abandon Chaco. People were chopping down trees that were not replenishing themselves and over-farming the land. Animals became harder and harder to find. Climate change undoubtedly led to increased desertification, a lower natural water table, and the increased risk of mudslide and landslides when it did rain. Craig Childs says this explanation alone is too simple to explain the abandonment. He says the people of the Four Corners were a quote-unquote elemental people who intrinsically understood the waning quality of the land. He says the Chacoans had already sent out their tendrils of influence across the land and into new expanses, and Chaco simply faded into the background, becoming more residential in nature. Towards the very end, there was intense violence, but even this was on a localized level. Additionally, there is evidence of the ritualized burning of the settlement. Another controversial theory was put forward by Michael Hernandez of the University of Palermo. Sometimes called the corn madness theory, it purports that Chaco's elites went on a frenzy of human sacrifice as a result of eating too much corn without any protein to supplement it. There is some solid science which suggests eating an all-corn diet is linked to neurological problems, but this theory fails to take into account the squash, mesquite beans, and other forms of protein available to the Puebloan peoples. Additionally, the Hopi have long been able to counter the negative effects of an all-corn diet by using fire ash in their pica bread, which activates the usually dormant, nutritious properties of corn. There are several native interpretations of the Chaco abandonment, which are extremely important in understanding what exactly happened there. They vary widely depending on whom you ask. Le Kuanuiswama relates, quote, Yupkovi, Chaco Canyon, became a gathering place for clans from local areas as well as clans who had stopped at what might be described as quote-unquote staging areas some distance away. Each clan chose a matriarch or a patriarch to lead it. Then the clans announced that they would share their ceremonies publicly. Some clans were allowed to construct ceremonial kivas, where the elders guided their followers. All ceremonies were for the good of the people. This went on for many years as more clans arrived. Slowly, clans left for different places. The Hopi Mesas, today's Zuni. Others went to Zia, Acoma, and Laguna. Yupkovi had served its purpose, and now it was proper to lay it to rest. Unquote. The Navajo tell a much darker story. In their telling, a tyrant, Nahawibilihi, the winner of people, was neither Pueblo or Navajo, but he still managed to gain power. He set about enslaving the people and demanding their labor to construct his grand palace, the Great House of Pueblo Alto. The people suffered under his rule, and many starved, until finally the people rose up in rebellion, killing or exiling the winner of people, and condemning the canyon as an evil place, which was to be avoided at all cost. Rena Swincel, a Puebloan from Santa Clara, said of Chaco, quote, My response to the canyon was that some sensibility other than my Puebloan ancestors had worked on the Chaco great houses. It was clear that the purpose of these great villages was not to restate their oneness with the earth, but to show the power and specialness of humans. For me, they represented a desire to control human and natural resources." Unquote. Acoma poet Simon J. Ortiz puts what happened at Chaco this way, quote, "Kashkatruti, Chaco, was a beautiful, serene place where everything was provided by the spirit helpers as long as the people respected the sacred powers of creation. After a time of this ideal life, the people became dissatisfied and greedy. They wanted more, although they had everything they needed, and they became demanding. Their demands, arrogance, and disrespect resulted in a battle with the sacred powers. They were made to give up the common language they understood and spoke, and henceforth had to find their own way of speaking. Traditional oral stories speak about Kashkatruti as being located to the north-northwest. Some people insist that a quote-unquote ancient civilization achieved the construction of Pueblo Bonito, Tetroquetl, and Casa Rinconada, and that this civilization vanished in the 13th century. To the Acoma people and other Native Americans, time and place are linked, a sacred continuum in which human consciousness is interdependent with creation and its process. And Chaco Canyon and its marvelous prehistoric communities attest to the undeniable truth of the existence of Native Americans 1,000 years ago and more, very much as they exist today. Michael Caboti of the Hopi tribe describes what happened to the Hopi tribe because of Chaco's intervention in a personal conversation remembered by Stephen H. Lekson, saying, quote, "Things were going awry at Hopi. The Hopi leaders awaited the help promised by the Kachina, which is a native religion, leaders, but it did not come. When the Hopi leaders had all but given up hope, they woke up to massed battalions of Kachinas, which were native ancestors or spirit warriors, which surrounded their village. They were the stern Kachinas, ogres, whippers, and so forth. To restore order at Hopi, they marched on the villages and meted out justice and correction. After a battle with Hopi forces, the Kachina armies prevailed and instituted a reign of very strict control. This was not what the Hopi leaders wanted, and they sent emissaries to the Kachina city, Chaco, to request that the stern Kachinas be withdrawn and replaced with kinder Kachinas. The Kachina leaders were persuaded and replaced the ogres and whippers with gentler Kachinas, but left many ogres and whippers in case things again went awry." Unquote. Victor Masaesva Jr. offers perhaps the most striking description of what occurred at Chaco Canyon, saying, quote, "The snake has gone to sleep, and the bear yawns. Hair, matted with blood clots, scorching baby fetuses. They, Chaco's upper class, hold their feasts in dark caves close by. Imagined stories cannot be told in the presence of snakes, of bears. Is it that they are particularly keen to smell at our pawakas, sorcerers, and perceptive regarding the sorcerers from Chaco Canyon, the ones who are convoluting nature, making the timeless cloud people Duskiapti crazy, and cursing the people to forgetfulness so that they could not remember the mistakes they had made? This is why the good-hearted people left Chaco, leaving the pawakas to their devices." Unquote. In each account, whether it was a simple migration story, a violent rebellion, or otherwise, one element of the story remains constant. Chaco Canyon was no longer the home the Puebloans had envisioned. The people left, the homes and dwellings burned, and the last ones may have met a violent end. It was the end of an era. Power no longer exuded itself from a single place. Instead, power became communalized, and dwellings became incredibly austere and practical. The people left and made their way back to their old haunts. They returned to Mesa Verde, which had largely been abandoned throughout the Pueblo II era, and began constructing vast palaces in the very cliffsides. The population exploded, and in spite of lacking a centralized authority, more ceremonies were performed than ever before. The people had liberated themselves, either through migration or violence, and they forged ahead to form a new identity. They boldly built higher and higher into the mountainsides. Imitations of Chaco would rise, but they would not reach the same heights accomplished by that polity. The following era was one of the most important in the development of modern Puebloan culture. Still, the question remains, why does this matter to us today? Besides the Puebloan peoples' obvious importance to the history of the Southwest and their numerous contributions to modern art and architecture, the story of Chaco and its fall is invaluable in understanding how and why societies fail. For its time and place, Chaco was one of the most inequitable societies in the world. For hundreds of years, a single powerful authority, or authorities, ruled with violence, majesty, and prestige over many tens of thousands. They demanded tribute, sacrifice, and human labor in exchange for a modicum of security and a handful of corn. These authorities likely argued that, without them, nothing would get done, and everything would fall into disrepair. It's possible that they claimed that the poor weren't contributing sufficiently, and that they didn't have the capacity to rule over themselves. They likely claimed that they were granted their authority by the flower world, and so on and so forth. I ask you, the listeners, under such arbitrary and violent rule, wouldn't any people choose rebellion in the prospect of death in exchange for the dream of freedom and self-determination, as opposed to continuing to live under oppressive forces? In the end, Chaco's central authority prevailed for about 250 years, largely due to inequality and violence. Coincidentally, the United States government has existed for about the same amount of time, and if we aren't careful, the next winner of people will become elected president. Regardless, on the next episode of Turning Tides, we'll discuss how the Puebloan peoples took to the hills in order to expand like never before. Were they escaping persecution, trying to defend themselves, or just attempting to find more space to grow corn? I hope you'll join me for that episode of Turning Tides. I'm your host, Joseph Pascone, and I'd like to take this time to say thank you to every single one of you for tuning in to the third year of the Turning Tides podcast. Even if this is your first time listening, thank you so much. I hope you'll tune in next time. Have a great day.
If you like what you heard today, you can support us by donating on PayPal at Turning Tides Podcast 1. We would also appreciate it if you take the time to rate and review Turning Tides on whatever platform you use to listen, and share the show with your family and friends. It really helps us bring the show to more listeners. Thank you so much for the support, and thanks again for listening.